Listeners, welcome to our Good Faith podcast presentation, Reading to Make Sense of the World. Here at Good Faith, we believe great books are like gifts from God. They are like maps made by wise travelers of the world who've made their way through the world before us, and they've passed these maps down to us so we can make sense of our world right now before us. Here's the problem, though. There's a lot of maps. There are so many books that we could read. And let's face it, all of us have so little time. So, how do we make the best use of our time to read the most helpful books? And fortunately, we have a regular source of expert guidance to share with you. I'm so happy to be joined by my friend, Jessica Hooten Wilson, who is the author of many books and the chair of the Great Books program at Pepperdine University. In each presentation of Reading to Make Sense of the World, Jessica will guide us towards a book that she's carefully selected that she feels really is worth our time, especially for this moment in the world. Jessica, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. This is going to be a great time.
All right. Well, what have you selected for us today?
So, I would like to talk about the Wingfeather Saga, which
Mm.
is more geared toward juvenile audiences or even young adults. But I would say two things about that. And then I would love to read an excerpt because it's a beautiful passage from the book. So, this is by Andrew Peterson. Um, it has now been turned into a series of a cartoon film series that you can get on Amazon as well. One thing is, a lot of people who are scared of reading literature, they can really be drawn to young adult fiction. And there's some people that might be embarrassed to say that, which they shouldn't. So I'm trying to take the embarrassment away from reading young adult fiction. It's these are the stories that C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers and
Yeah,
Edgar Allan Poe and throughout history, people have always loved children's stories, right? The
totally.
really good ones. And so I think we need to get back to that, to be able to like talk about children's stories, especially
Mm,
ones that are beautiful and have deep meaning, ones that help us share a vocabulary with our children or with
mm.
children that are in our communities, that we can help address the world with that same shared vocabulary. So I think the Wingfeather Saga is one of those great works of literature that follows in the tradition of people like Lewis and Tolkien, and we should all read it.
I love that idea of using books to create a common vocabulary and almost a common imaginative world that you can
Mhm.
share with children. It's getting down at their level, but also realizing their worlds that have been created for them have something to teach us. It's not just a sort of paternalistic top down, but there's a real learning that has to happen. Reminds me of when I was raising my two daughters. I read a book of series that I think I've told you about before, the Betsy Tacy Tibbs series by Maud Hart
Right.
Lovelace. And those, like, we got so into the books that we joined the Betsy Tacy Tibb Club. Like, we paid our dues. We were club members of the Betsy Tacy Tibb Club, and that was like, I still have my membership card that I hold with great pride and great fondness because it does bring
Yeah.
back memories of all these conversations I had with my daughters while reading these children's books. So, okay, I'm sold on the value. Give us the excerpt that you have, and tell us why you chose this excerpt.
Well, I know your guests know Andrew Peterson well because he's
Yep.
a great songwriter. And within this text, just like Tolkien and Lewis do in their own work, he includes songs. I mean, this is
Mm.
kind of an ancient practice of storytelling in which you have songs in the middle of it. Or if you think of reading First and Second Samuel, and there's like the songs of
Mm.
Hannah and David that are kind of into the story. So here's a song that's in the middle of the Wingfeather Saga. It's actually at the end, but I'm going to just read the whole thing, and it'll read kind of like a poem, but it's something beautiful that I hope your listeners can enjoy. And maybe we can talk about why this is done this way. It's a
Yep.
gorgeous song. The world is whispering. Listen, child. The world is telling a tale. When the sea foam froths in the winter wild, or the findril flies in the gale, when the sky is mad with the swirling storm and thunder shakes the hall, child, keep watch for the passing form of the one who made it all.
Mm.
Listen, child, to the hallish wind, to the hush of heather down, to the voice of the brook at the stony bend and the bells of rise in town. The dark of the heart is a darkness deep, and the sweep of the night is wide, and the pain of the heart when the people weep is an overwhelming tide. And yet, and yet, When the tide runs low, as the tide will always do, and the heavy sky where the bellows blow is bright at last and blue, and the sun ascends in the quiet morn, and the sorrow sinks away, when the veil of death and dark is torn asunder by the day, then the light of love is the flame of spring, and the flow of the river strong, and the hope of the heart as the people sing is an everlasting song. The winter is whispering green and gold, and the heart is whispering too. It's a story the maker has always told, and the story, my child, is true.
Hmm. That is beautiful. And there's it's sort of it just sort of sweeps you away.
I know.
Um there's the feeling of it, and then there's the thoughts about
Oh,
it. And I'm almost wanting to just stay in the feeling of it because I feel like I've been
right. Good.
enchanted almost.
Hmm.
Like somebody
Hmm.
has said a spell over me with those
Yes.
words. And I'm trying to
Yes.
like the spell feels like I'm being like I'm being invited to see a hidden world or a world that's there
Oh,
that's been hidden
yeah.
from me. What feelings come for you as you read that?
Oh, oh, I love that. I like the idea of spell too, the way
Yeah.
you said that. You know, some of the things that the reason I think magic spells are so
Mm,
persuasive is because the reality is that God says, let there be light, and there's light.
mm,
And so
yeah.
this idea that these words can have this power and that we are created in the image of a God who then becomes the word for us, and that we are
Yeah.
participating in making words, making things.
Yeah.
This is kind of a power that we all know we have. And, we pretend like the connection, of course, is also then falls apart where it's like, well, I can't say tree grow and it grows. But at
Yeah.
the same time, when you say like, I love you, you you are loving. Like
Yeah.
there is some reality of saying things and making them real. And I
Yeah.
think that that's what I feel when I hear this. It's like the everlasting song, the song that is there if we can but hear it, the song that we can like taste in the words of this, that when we read it, it becomes true to us, right?
Yeah.
It's truer than the fictional world he's created. There's some truth that is deep down under things that he got at that it feels like it rises to the surface.
I'm thinking about putting on my adult hat now. Charles Taylor, a great thinker, social thinker, writes a lot about how the West has been going through this eons long disenchantment with the world, that the world no longer feels full of mystery, of more meaning than is there at the surface, that combination of science, technology, a host of other sources has, like he said, disenchanted the world. And yet when I hear you read that passage, it gives me like a glimpse or whisper of, no, wait, it hasn't happened completely yet. The world hasn't been
Yeah,
completely
yeah.
disenchanted. There's
Yes.
ways to recover the enchantment. And so let's talk more about why children's books are so important, perhaps especially for even for adults, to
Mhm.
re-enchant the world the way we're talking about.
Yeah, so one of the great books I'd also recommend, I feel like every time we talk, I'm tricking you because I'm like recommending a book and then I recommend like five with that
That's
one
good. You're
book that I
smuggling it in. I love
recommend.
it.
And
Yeah.
I don't mean to. But G.K. Chesterton wrote this In Defense of Fairy Tales
Mm,
in a book called Orthodoxy. And what he talks about is when kids are little, they know that there's good and evil. They just kind of they sense it, they feel it within themselves, and they see it in the world around them. And so they want stories that tell them why certain things are good and how to overcome the evil.
mm,
And a lot of times in our culture, as we grow up, we forget that reality. We forget that there is
mm,
good and that there is evil, and there's a way of overcoming that evil. And we fall prey to pragmatism and utilitarianism, and maybe even doing things because we're like, well, it justifies because I'm trying to do it for this goal and for this end. And these stories kind of pull that apart, right?
mm.
Instead, it's like, no, you pull out your sword when there's a dragon to defeat, like
Yeah.
you put on the armor, you get ready, you don't do the wrong thing. And these stories kind of ready us for battle in a sense, like they show us that the world really is full of these like spiritual things that we are participating in all the time, though we pretend or we've become immune to seeing them that way. maybe spiritual is it spiritual maybe too strong for some people. You could even say moral, or you could even,
Yeah.
there's other ways you could phrase it. But the reality is that when we participate, we know whether things make us feel good or bad, right? Like
Yeah.
we know, and we can either deaden that sense, or these tales can wake it back up in us.
Jessica, what do you think about these books when they are made into a visual format, when they're made into a cartoon or a
Mm,
movie or so forth like that? Does some of that enchanting power actually get lost? Because it seems to me some of the enchantment is the evocation of
hmm.
imagination that
Yes.
happens in the reader and in the child, even in the adult. And I guess I worry that when we convert like the Narnia Chronicles or Tolkien,
Hmm.
or now even the Wingfeather Saga into visual
Yeah.
format, we're actually losing some of that power. What do you think about that?
I think so. It's funny when you can remember. Okay, I don't know if this is true for everyone, so let me just speak from my own experience. When I watch a movie, I sometimes can forget it the minute I watched it. And so I've had these experiences where my husband and I'll go through like Netflix and I'm like, oh, we
Yeah.
should watch this. I wanted to see it. And he's like, we did watch that. I'm like, no, we
Yeah.
didn't.
Right.
And then we'll start watching it. It's midway through. I'm like, oh, we did watch this. I know what's going to happen. Because they just become so forgettable. Like they don't
Yeah.
actually transform me. They were enjoyable for the moment. And it's like a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
And when I read something, because I'm part of the creative activity when I
Yeah.
read, I'm creating what the characters look like. I am creating what the trees look like. I'm creating the whole world. It actually is forming me in a different
Right.
way. And so they're a lot harder to forget, right? And it doesn't mean you
Mm.
remember everything, but you have your own experience of it that you do remember. It's still
Yeah.
there inside you in some way, and that cosmos becomes part of your cosmos. It becomes part of your way of seeing the world in a different way than film does. So sometimes film just can't make that same kind of impression because you're more passive than you are active in that way of
And we
reading.
really probably need to think about guarding what has been formed from us or formed in us from distortions from the visual that is not actually in us, but has been created by somebody else. I mean, so my wife reads the Lord of the Rings saga
Mm,
regularly. She's probably read a dozen, 15, 20 times or something like that.
yeah.
And she has resolutely refused. She was tempted, but she refused
Hmm.
to watch the movies precisely because
Mm,
she wanted to guard her own images that had been
yeah.
formed, and she didn't want to suddenly have Viggo Mortensen, come to
Yeah.
her mind when she was thinking about Aragorn.
Right.
And so I don't think that I'm not trying
Yeah.
advocating that we be, absolute, sort of Pharisees about this sort of thing.
Hmm.
No visual, but I do think there's something about guarding our eyes, especially around stories that have had that deep formative
Hmm.
influence us, because we want to protect that. Those are fragile, precious treasures. All right, so Jessica, I have one last question. All right, so for listeners who want to go deeper into this world that Andrew Peterson
Hmm.
has created, what would you say is the best way to dive in, either with their kids or just maybe even on their own?
Yeah, so our family read this aloud,
Okay.
and so every night before, so I have an 11, 9, 6, and 1 year old just to kind of give the space of, so people can kind of imagine what this looks like. And so we would sit, and my husband or I, we would take turns just reading, and we'd read about an hour every night before bed. So our whole family is listening in. My 6 year old likes to draw while she listens, so she would like draw the characters. This is before the film came out. And so we just would do this together, getting to like hear it together and share it together. I will warn you, at the very end, when we started getting towards the end of the narrative, my husband started staying up till 2 a.m., finishing it ahead of us, and then he would
What?
backtrack. He was so into it. He like started getting ahead and not telling us. And then the next day he would be like trying to read it with us and pretend he didn't know everything that was going to happen.
Oh
But
man.
this book was so good though. Like I mean, I was bawling at the end of these,
Mm,
and I have heard numerous adults talk about the same experience of like reading it with their children and just crying. Like
mm,
his series, it shows you the love of God in a different way than you've experienced it before. I mean, he really has been formed by knowing God and reading the
yeah.
scriptures, and it comes out in the stories that he's created. So I would say people should grab Wingfeather Saga. They should read it aloud as a family. It is surprisingly very much, I would say it's a devotional time. Like I know it's not reading the scripture, but it is a new way of understanding the scripture that I also think can bless your family.
Have you ever discussed these books with Andrew Peterson?
I haven't discussed his books with him.
Okay.
I did a series called the Scandal of Reading podcast for about
Mm,
3 seasons in order to discuss some of the books that I do write on. And one of
yeah.
them, we had a shared passion for Walter Wangerin Jr.'s
Mm.
book. And so we discussed that one together. And we do love Lord of the Rings together too. We've also had conversations about Lord of the Rings. So I know that he's been informed about that, but I haven't actually talked to him about his books.
Well, we've had the pleasure of having him on in our Advent series. And for those of you listeners who enjoyed hearing Andrew Peterson talk about his art, or certainly have appreciated his song, really strongly encourage you to check out his Wingfeather Saga. It really is a great gift, not just to children, but to adults.
Mhm.
Jessica, thanks once again for helping us make the best use of our reading time.
Thank you so much.